The most watched Super Bowl of all time was Super Bowl 39 back in 2015 when the New England Patriots beat the Seattle Seahawks. 114.4 million people tuned in to watch. And that number doesn't include streaming services, to the best of my knowledge. I can't imagine that kind of pressure that comes with performing in front of that large of a crowd. I can't imagine being a referee in a game like that. You couldn't pay me enough money to ref a rec league in Pleasant View. That is brutal. I have watched it. I have watched some of you. So there's no way that I would leave myself open to that much scrutiny to be watched by 114 million people as I try to make the call. I've criticized you, so I'll criticize myself. I used to have a really bad problem of yelling at referees. Never umpires for some reason, only refs. I don't know why, but honestly, it was drilled into me by my grandmother. If I yelled at an umpire, it was not going to be good. So I just yelled at refs. I coached for a number of years, and you could pretty much bank on it. If we were losing, which was often, I would find just about every excuse under the sun to shift the blame outside of poor coaching. And more often than not, the nearest ref was the one who I would draw a bead on, and they would hear all of my complaining. And to this day, seriously, I look back on some of the dumb things that I have said to referees, and I am absolutely embarrassed. Well, several years ago, we were watching one of our students play basketball or volleyball, I can't remember which one, in one of the high schools, and I was getting frustrated at some of the calls, and under my breath, I just said something weird, like somebody ought to pray for this guy's eyes, or something like that. And I looked over at barely 1-year-old Claire, and this is what she was doing. She starts praying there in the stadium, or in the gymnasium. So that kind of made me stop and think about how I talk about referees. But they have one of the hardest jobs in the world because they are supposed to see everything on the field or on the court, no matter where they are or who's in the way. Their job is to be ubiquitous, and it's not possible. In fact, it is all but impossible to call a perfect game in whatever the sport. They simply have their limitations as to what they can see from their point of view. We need to remind ourselves often of that. But God doesn't have those limitations. There's nothing that ever steps in front of his weight in which he cannot see what's going on past that person. In fact, one of the attributes that most astounds me about God is that he is omnipresent. Not that God just sees everything from above, but that God is everywhere present. There is no place where God is not. And just listen to David as he describes this attribute in Psalm 139. We read this in our Sunday school class this morning, or at least a portion of Psalm 139. He writes in verse 7 of this psalm, "Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in hell or Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide me from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you." There is no place where God is not. There is nothing that God cannot and does not see. He's watching, always watching, which can be an ominous thought and an encouraging thought, both at the same time. And tonight we'll be looking at a text in a name of God where we see him as all-seeing, and it's going to be a very positive thing. It comes to us as the majority of God's names do in the book of Genesis. I hope you've realized that as we've gone through and studied in these Sunday evening services the names of God, that the majority of them are found in Genesis and Exodus. I never really realized that until this particular study. That's not an accident. That's no coincidence, as I've said before. In the first couple of books of the Bible, God is He is setting the standard for who He is so that we can interpret the rest of Scripture in that light. He gives us the law of first mention early so that you know who God is all throughout the prophecies and the New Testament. These are His introductions to humanity. And introductions, they come at the beginning of the relationship. He's telling us all that we need to know about Him up front. Which, by the way, that is something distinct from Christianity to cults. Cults always keep some knowledge away from you to where you have to go deeper or pay more and more in order to get more knowledge or to get more wisdom or understanding in that thought pattern. But Christianity, God tells you who He is in the first two books of the Bible. He is up front, not hiding from us at all. He's not telling us to go deeper down into a spiritual rabbit hole until we finally understand who He is and how He interacts with us in our last days. He's up front. I am Elohim, the Most High. I am Jehovah, Yahweh, the self-existent one. I am Jehovah Jireh. I will see to your atonement. I am El Shaddai, the one who gives your sustenance. And I am Jehovah Rapha, the one who makes wrong things right. We would not have known those things about God unless we experienced those things or unless He told us those things about Himself. Even honestly, if we had experienced them, if we had seen that He is the one who will see to our atonement, we probably wouldn't have given Him credit for being that one because we would have thought, well, we've accomplished this. But here, right up front, He tells us, you are not God, I am. El Roi is a name of God that only shows up once in the Bible. And it's how He introduces Himself to us tonight. But more interesting than that it just shows up once in the Bible is that it's not a name that God attributes to Himself like most others, but rather El Roi is a name that is assigned to Him from another. And this person who names God is quite another person altogether. Not ordinary. So let's again pick up in Genesis chapter 16 when we are introduced to Abraham and Sarah, or in this case, before God doubles down on the covenant that He has with them and names them Abraham and Sarah, He is calling them Abram or Abram and Sarai. Verse 1, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. They're 86, 76, we believe, to be about this time. Verse 2 says, so Sarai said to Abram, see now the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Let's just say this up front. Be careful when you read Scripture that you don't read it as just a list of heroes or 5 ways that this person lived a good life and you can too. The Bible is not a collection of hero stories. It is a collection of scoundrel stories who have a hero. Abram and Sarai, their sin of allowing a handmaid to play surrogate, while it is culturally acceptable in that day, is not God's plan at all. It completely denies. I heard somebody say that because the 10 Commandments had not been written at this time, that then this whole idea of not coveting someone else's wife and not committing adultery, it didn't apply to Abraham. That is utter nonsense. Because even if the 10 Commandments had not been listed, the Genesis account of leave your father and mother and cling only to your wife would still apply. It doesn't matter what culture says. It doesn't matter if this is culturally acceptable thousands of years ago or not. It denies the promise of God to give them a child in His time and in His way. He's promised them, Sarai, you will have a child. And they find fault with His way. This helpmeet, who is supposed to guard and keep him from sinning, is now encouraging her husband to take part in adultery. That's so sad. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai, equally as sad. But that Abraham heeded the voice of Sarai, it could be also understood that Abraham denied the voice of God. When one person tells you one thing and God tells you another, and you heed their voice and not God's, that means you are ignoring God. Dangerous ground. Very dangerous ground. Verse 3. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband, Abram, to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Let's try to explain that, because the wording is a little off. It's a little strange. The thing that Sarai had wanted to happen, happened. Hagar conceives. And this would now legally be her child if she wanted it. But something happened that she didn't account for in her scheming. Hagar's attitude begins to change. No longer did she feel or act like the little girl who they brought out of Egypt a decade earlier. Now, in Sarai's eyes, Hagar has become entitled, self-important, a threat even. Hagar was able to give Abram what Sarai could not, and they both knew it. We have no idea the details of the despising, whether verbal or physical altercations, but we could just suffice it to say the two do not get along. And it is as if Hagar holds it over Sarai that she's able to have a child, and Sarai's not. So let me give you a warning. Here's the label on the next couple of verses. We're about to go into a very dangerous place in verse 5. We are going to go into the home, really the bedroom of the couple who has displaced God with their own selfish ambitions and their own reasoning. And that's a dangerous place to be. There is no amount of money that you could pay me to referee this fight that's about to happen. And so, if I can mix all of my sports metaphors, since it's a sport night apparently, we're going to go ringside, and we are going to call the play-by-play as this fight, or excuse me, they're married, so discussion unfolds. Some of you, you'll look in this story and you say, well, Sarai is obviously wrong. And others, your wife, is going to say, no, Abram's wrong. But the truth is, they are both desperately wrong. Equally. Before we get there, I am so glad that God has not led anyone to transcribe any of mine and Rachel's debates into Holy Scripture. That would not be a pretty thing. You would see how often I am wrong. But the Lord thought that it's important to have this marital spat recorded for us to evaluate, and it starts off with a doozy. Verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abram, ding, ding, my wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. the Lord judge between you and me. What even does that mean? My wrong be upon you, Abram? Is that some kind of passive-aggressive apology? I'm wrong, Abram, but it's still your fault. I was wrong to have told you to do what you did, but it's still your fault. Actually, that's not really what it says. The ESV translators, they get it closer to the original language, and it makes a lot more sense the way they write it. She says, may the wrong done to me be on you. Sarai isn't acknowledging any wrongdoing on her part. She's not saying that she has done the wrong. She isn't blaming Abram for the pregnancy, but she's blaming Abram for Hagar's attitude for conceiving. It seems like she felt that Abram had encouraged Hagar to think more highly of herself, and that made Sarai angry. That other phrase that is just kind of strange, it's out of the ordinary, where she concludes with, the Lord judge between you and me. The New English translation, it renders the phrase as, God is going to get you for this, Abram. Your wrongdoing, God's going to get you for this. So, Abram, what do you say to that? Abram. He is so docile in all of this story. He is so unwilling to take the lead in his family. It is disgusting. Abram, sleep with my servant. Okay. Abram, all of this is your fault for doing what I told you to do. And verse 6 is pretty much a, yes, dear. It is. Read it. So Abram said to Sarai, indeed your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. And when Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar, Hagar fled from her presence. Abram, I don't mean to just be rude to one of our patriarchs, but he is so spineless that he almost encourages a woman who is carrying his child to be dealt harshly with, mistreated. We have no idea if this involves physical abuse. I tend to think probably not, but whatever it is, it's so severe that Hagar cannot stand it any longer. She does not want to be anywhere near Sarai. She has had it up to here with that woman. And so she runs. She escapes. And this isn't the kind of setting where you can just run to a nearby town. Abram's clan, they live in tents, migrating where the livestock need to graze next. There aren't any nearby towns. So this undeveloped, ill-thought plan of just getting out of Dodge doesn't really go well for Hagar. In verse 7, it says, now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. Interestingly enough, she runs to the same place where we looked last Sunday night in the book of Exodus, into the wilderness of Shur, into the wilderness of Sin, it's named otherwise. And there, she is by a spring of water when the angel of the Lord found her. This is what's called a Christophany, the angel of the Lord. It's a revealing of pre-incarnate Christ. What that means is, this is Jesus before Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Don't think for a second that was the first time that Jesus existed when he cried that Bethlehem December night. It wasn't December. He has always existed. And he oftentimes throughout the Old Testament will come down and visit with people. And he, who was wrapped in flesh, would walk amongst them and talk to them. We see it multiple times all throughout the Bible. So this is Jesus, and in verse 8, Jesus said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from? Where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Notice she only answers one of the questions. She only answers, where have you come from? She's running from Sarai, but she is running to nothing. For the first time in her whole life, probably, Hagar has liberty. She can go wherever she like, but she had no idea where she would like to go. And I feel for her. I mean, I really do. She is wrong in several accounts in this story, but if we're, looking at the gauge of who is more wrong, it's not Hagar. I don't know how you can read this account and not think anything less than that Hagar is just treated as a piece of property, that she's used for what she could do for Sarai, that she's used for what she could do for Abram. And the only time in her whole life she has ever experienced any kind of worth is when she's carrying this child. And that certainly hasn't gone the way that she had hoped or planned for it to have gone. And so listen to the counsel that Jesus Christ gives her. It's hard for a modern day free person living in a free society to hear this counsel, but it is for her safety and for her benefit that Jesus tells her. Verse 9, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. The promise, I think of this, the promise that was not originally for Hagar, but had been forced upon her by the evil choices of Abram and Sarai, that promise has now included her. God knew what would happen. He wasn't surprised when they went down to Egypt. He wasn't surprised when they bought Hagar. He wasn't surprised when Sarai had this bright idea to sin against God and find fault with his plan. He knew Abram would sin. He knew that Hagar would conceive. And so he has now expanded the blessing of family and a multitude of a family to her. This nobody. But he doesn't just give her the promise or the blessing of a family. He gives her the blessing of freedom as well. Read verse 11. It's written in poetry form, and it's almost as if Jesus gets poetic in his prophecy. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. And you shall call his name Ishmael. Underline that if you take notes in Scripture. Because the Lord has heard your affliction. Underline that. Notice how he is described, how this Ishmael, her son, will be described in verse 12. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Now, some of that might seem like a curse, especially verse 12. In fact, the most literal reading of this is, Hagar, your son will be a wild donkey of a man. Literally what it says in the original language. His hand shall be against everyone, and everyone's hand shall be against him. How is that a blessing? Really, all of that is just saying that Ishmael will be his own man. He will be as free as a wild donkey. He will live as he wants to live, even when it doesn't fit within the social confines of those around him. all of Hagar's dreams, her whole life to be free, would be realized in her son. What a blessing. Hagar, the freedom that you have wished for but never enjoyed will be extended to your son. That's all that this young slave girl has ever wanted. She's wanted a family to call her own, and she's wanted a freedom that she could claim. And God has just promised them both to her. And I want you to look how she responds. She's not theologically trained, neither is Abram for that account. If he was, he sure messed up on how to live. But she calls the name of the Lord who spoke to her in verse 13. You are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. She's a stranger outside the blessing of God's people. She's just a slave girl that they picked up en route to the promised land. But now she's been grafted into a blessing of her own. And she cries out, El Roi, you see me. She who had slipped unnoticed among the tents of power and influence for so long, God takes notice of her. And she names God El Roi. That's abnormal, isn't it? To name God. I certainly don't suggest that that should be a part of your personal walk with God, that you give God different names other than what He's revealed to you. Don't do that. So I think what's actually happening here is that the Spirit of God is so moving in and on Hagar that she prophesies or she proclaims the truth of who God is, that He is a God who sees her. He is El Roi. She is rightly speaking God's name. She's not going rogue and just naming God something that she likes on a whim. God is giving this divine revelation to her. Hagar, I do see you. He sees her in her desperation. He sees her in her hopelessness. He sees her, listen, he sees her in her sin of rebellion. This isn't just all the warm and fuzzies. She is on the run. She has rebelled. She has committed sin. And God sees her in that rebellion. He sees her there. But He doesn't leave her there. He comes down. And He visits with her in such a way that it changes just about everything about her. She even names the well that's nearby, Beer Lahai Roi, the well of the one who lives and sees. It's as if she wants to remember this incident for all her life. And maybe she wants to come back and she wants to show her boy that location someday. Ishmael, right there, that well, that is where I saw the one who sees me. Well, whether Ishmael ever sees it or not, we don't know. But the story goes on, and I'll summarize a great deal. They return to Sarai and Abram. Hagar obeys Jesus, but everything is not happily ever after. Not even close. In fact, about a decade will pass, and when Isaac, the son of promise, is born to Abraham and Sarah, they suddenly find that their tents are just not big enough for two families. There's some joking of Isaac by Ishmael, whether innocent or malicious, we don't know. But it seals the deal with Sarah as she angrily stomps up to Abraham and says, "Send this woman and her son away." And Abraham, grieving, hears and heeds the voice of his wife, and Scripture also says he heeds the voice of God as He says, "Don't fear to cast them out." And so once again, over a decade later, Hagar finds herself wandering in another desert. And this time, it's not her choice. She hasn't run away. And she can see no well. Nor can she see any God. And she's convinced that in this sandstorm that God can't even see her. So read with me Genesis 21's account. Verse 15. And the water in the skin, this is the skin, the canteen that Abraham had given them before he banished them, was used up. And she placed the boy, Ishmael, under one of the shrubs, I think to save him from the bearing heat of the sun. Verse 16, she went down and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. Verse 17. And God heard the voice of the lad. Now remember, I had you underline something back in Genesis chapter 16, and that was, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. Not only does Hagar say, El Roi, you are the God who sees, but she names her son Ishmael, which means you are the God who hears. And while she probably didn't understand everything that it meant back then, she definitely understands it now. 10 years down the road, at the point of death, not bearing to be near her son as they both are dying, she sits across from him about a distance of a bow shot away, not wanting to be near him because she can't stand that all of this is her fault. And God, who sees, hears this child who had been born out of his will. Verse 17 of Genesis 21. And then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, what ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and she filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and he became an archer. He dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. I am certain that we can't just end that narrative with, and they lived happily ever after, but they lived far better off than they ever had before. He is the God who sees you where you are. Lonely and desperate, hopeless, thinking you are too far gone, a nobody. He sees you. And he's the God who hears you when you cry out to him. The greatest lie that Satan has sold to those who are hopeless is that God won't hear you. He does. You are not too far gone. Your choices, your sin, your evil scheming has not too far separated you from the one who inclines his ear to his creation. He sees you. He sees you in your sin, and he doesn't leave you in your sin. You're never too far, and you're never too empty. He sees, El Roi, and he saves. He's the God who hears you and answers your call.